Okay. Can you see my screen, April?
I can.
Perfect. All right. So we are presenting today a version of what we presented at Expo for the first time. And we had such interest in this topic that we wanted to make it available to a broader audience. So we're going to give you a condensed version of what we shared at Expo, since this is a shorter session. And then, like I said, we'll follow up for round two. But what we're hearing from everyone across the country is this need to attract new adopters and wondering where they all are. So we're going to go through a lot of the data that supports what's been happening in the general animal sheltering climate, go through what's been happening on the supply and demand side, and then give you some actionable things that you can start today to hopefully start to shift adopters back to our shelters. So I'm Stephanie with Shelter Animals Count, Executive Director, and April, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Yeah, April Huntsman, Senior Director of Animal Welfare at Adopt Pet.
Great. All right, so let's start on the supply side. When we look at intakes, we are starting for the first time actually now, thanks to being able to collect animal level data, able to share insights by that next level down of details. So size, age, breed, et cetera. And so we've done some preliminary analysis for that through Q1 for a lot of what we're going to show you through today, and we'll be able to updating it as we go for the follow-up. But when we look at intake rates by size, first, this is one of the problems that we face in our industry is a lack of standardization. And so when we are going to be looking at the next few slides, one of the challenges is the weights that people assign to animals, or the sizes that people assign to animals, vary. And a lot of the shelter software allows you to set your own parameters for that. So a quick ChatGPT of animals groupings by size offered these options. When we were presented the first time, and I've presented to a couple others since, we've asked the audience, do you agree with all, some, or none? And pretty much everybody had a different opinion. So most people agreed with some, and that's part of the challenge of this. And I've talked to people since that have even said they assign an animal a size based on what they plan to charge for an adoption fee. So it really doesn't have anything to do even with the actual weight. It's more an adoption fee groupings. And so I say all of this as a setting the stage for future, and why we need to standardize how we're entering data. So the data that we are looking at means what we think it means. SAC will continue to make some recommendations on that in terms of age and size and a whole host of other things. But I really challenge everybody to look at it within your own organization. And then the other issue is making sure you're entering it so that we have data to actually pull. So when we look at this, the next few slides, these are self-identified size groupings, not necessarily this, but at least gives an idea of what we're looking at. For the most part, we will fall in these ranges. We also included extra small with small and extra large with large for the purpose so that we can just look at small, medium, large going forward. So when we look at the past 6 years, including this year, we're really seeing this V shape when we look at 2019 through 2024 for small dog intakes. We started high in 2019, and now we have actually a higher proportion rate of small dogs coming in than before the pandemic. But as you see, we did dip in about 2021, about the year after the pandemic's official start. When we look at that by medium dogs, we actually see it a little more flat line, but down and trending down for 2024, but more or less around this 33%, 34% cover. You can see the vertical axis, the change in percentage is only 2, so it's not a huge difference even when the bars are dropping down a little bit. And then when we look at large dogs, we see the opposite of what's been happening with small dogs. So really probably no surprise to anybody here. We're seeing and feeling since the pandemic, a lot of large dogs coming in. The hopeful trend, though, is that we are starting to see that proportion decrease for large dogs since 2021 when it peaked. So as we'll go into some of the things in the next slide, this isn't just, as we all know, this doesn't just happen in a vacuum of 1 year at a time. This is a rolling thing that happens year over year. And so it's notable to know that while what we're hearing and seeing in a lot of organizations right now is this challenge with large dogs, if we're not paying attention to what's happening with small and medium dogs as well, this could easily shift, just like how we've looked at this with a dog and cat problem. But this is hopeful initial trends to show that maybe our large dog intakes may not continue to climb, but that doesn't mean that we don't have a lot of large dogs in our shelters, which we'll talk about why. So in the chat, if you all want to comment, are you experiencing fewer dog adoptions than in the last 2 years? Go ahead and keep adding to the chat as we'll go for speed. Oh, I'm sorry, April, this is you.
No, that's okay. I like that you got everyone going. Yeah, so we actually, AdoptAbat has about 17,000 organizations that use our site. And so we went out to the masses and asked the question, just directly on our site. Every time a different shelter or rescue logged in, they would get asked this question: are you experiencing fewer dog adoptions than the last 2 years? And next slide. And what you can see is overwhelmingly, most organizations said yes. So 81%, 4 out of 5 said yes. And then it looks like everyone on this call is also a yes as well. So I don't know who the 19% are that are not experiencing it. It could be organizations that actually don't do dog adoptions. So perhaps they only do cat adoptions, or they're primarily other breed or other species specific. But in addition to that, we wanted to ask why. Why is it that we think that there's fewer dog adoptions? Because that really narrows in our focus and can help us pull data. And this is what we got from that question. So we allowed organizations to multi-select, so they could pick more than one. The highest one is definitely the state of the economy. So 75% selected that as one of the reasons why. And then we see that general adoption interest is just declining. Overall, people are just less interested in getting a dog right now, followed by weight and breed restrictions set by landlords. I saw in the chat some people talking about this already, but it does feel like anecdotally that landlords are just getting more and more restrictive. And then the next one was breeders are taking adopters away from shelters and rescue organizations. So they hopped on this whole pandemic interest, and now they're taking away all the people that would have been considering adoption and getting them to purchase. And then the smallest one here that we're going to talk about today is just the peer-to-peer placement is taking adopters away. So what we're going to be doing in this presentation is talking about each one of these individually and the data that our organizations collectively or other organizations have around this to understand, is this specific reason actually causing the lack of adopters that we all are feeling. Next slide. So everyone, off to the side of the webinar, I want you to bookmark this website. It's trends.google.com. This is a free website to use, and this basically allows you to peek inside the minds of people who are searching the internet. And you can use this website to basically compare up to 5 search phrases. So you can see for this one, I compared dogs for sale, puppies for sale, cats for sale, and kittens for sale. And what's great about this is you can search for the entire country, but you can actually drill this down to either a state level, even a metro. If you're in a large metro area, like for instance, Dallas, Fort Worth, you can actually see all the searches that are being done. You can change the time frame as well. So as we look at some data, we're going to go back to 2019, but you can see on this specific slide, I actually went back to 2014, so you could go back 10 years. And the way that these numbers work is that it's looking and comparing them to each other over that period of time. So the highest search will be 100. So you can see in December 2016, puppies for sale maxed out at 100. And then it's showing in comparison to that max how it's doing today. So you can see puppies for sale today is much lower in comparison to all of these other search results, though. So when we look at puppies, dogs, cats, kittens, you can see puppies and dogs are searched far more than cats and kittens for sale, which is great. And you can hover over these details and really dig in. And so I just want everyone to have this website. You can search other search phrases not at all related to dogs for sale. You can search dogs for adoption. You can compare dogs for sale to dogs for adoption. But you can also do things like surrender my pet, give up my pet, and look at those search phrases. And this can really help you with your website and understanding the language that people are using when they're searching the internet. Because basically 90% of all searches are done on Google. So if you know what people are searching, you can make sure your website shows up in those search results. Next slide. So what we're looking at specifically here is what is happening since before the pandemic to today with buy a dog and adopt a dog. And what we see on the yellow buy a dog is it was hovering about half as many searches were done on buy a dog compared to adopt a dog in 2019. And now the same number of buy a dog and adopt a dog are done today. So Buy a Dog has really maintained its level of interest on the internet, like searching, regardless of the pandemic. There was a slight spike there in 2020, but nothing compared to what happened with Adopt a Dog. So what we see with Adopt a Dog is people were searching it pretty consistently. And then on April 20th, 2020 is when we see it maxed out. And then it started waning down. And when we talk about general adoption interest, what we do see is that fewer people are searching adopt a dog now than they were in the previous years. It's, I think, about 90% decrease compared to 2019, January 2019. And it hasn't been the same since the pandemic, since July of 2021. It's actually gone down. And it does look like it's trending to stay right about the same as it is right now. But this definitely shows you, as far as people searching online this term to trying to find dogs for adoption, there are less people searching than there were in 2019. Next slide. So I wanted to quickly just toss cats in the mix to see what is going on with cats, because I know this is a dog presentation, but it definitely feels like as we give presentations and as we're interacting with different organizations, we definitely hear less about cats and feeling that pressure that we used to feel around cats. And this might be one of the reasons why. And as you look at adopt a cat and comparing that with dogs, what we see is adopt a cat is higher than it was before the pandemic. And it also spiked in 2020, but it is definitely decreased less quickly. And also, it's actually maintaining. And what I like to, my phrase I kind of say around search results is that dog adoption search trends are waning and dog adoption or cat adoption search trends are maintaining. So we're still seeing a lot of interest, and you can see in comparison, it's like twice as many people search adopt a cat now compared to adopt a dog. Next slide.
Okay, so staying on that theme of comparing the species and adoption trends, when we look back to 2016, we are seeing what we all expected, based on those of us who were in the industry then. We were adopting a lot more dogs than we were adopting cats. 2017, it was about equal, 50-50. 2018 and 2019, again, more dogs, more cats. And then since the pandemic, we've seen that actually shift, where we are seeing more cats being adopted than dogs in terms of numbers. The other interesting thing is that this is still occurring at the time when TNR programs are in effect throughout the country. So we're bringing in, really ideally, only cats that are truly adoptable. And we are still adopting more than we were when those programs were probably newer. The other thing is too, that doesn't take into account on in our programs and if they've returned to pre-pandemic levels, all of those things. But it is worth noting that in the past 4 years, we don't yet have the data for 2024 to share in the terms of total number, but in the last 4 years, we've seen more cats being adopted than dogs. So this feeling of, or not the feeling, the data supports the search trends of more people also searching. So one of the things that April mentioned that shelter workers were sharing was the state of economy leading to a decrease in dog adoptions. And we all know from our own pets, our own shelter operations, that everything is just a lot more expensive. It's a lot more expensive to live in all of the things we're doing, and it's a lot more expensive to care for our pets. So when we look at the annual expenses with dogs and cats, this is just or the most recent available data that we have at APPA. No surprise, it costs a lot more money to care for a dog than it does a cat. A lot of that is weight-based, but a lot of it too is I guess some of it is also the things that they get into and the different risks and all of the other parts that come into the surgical vet part of things. I know I just had a surgery for my 110-pound dog, which was based on weight, just as his food is, and it was far more expensive than any surgery I've ever had to do for a cat. So we're seeing that in our shelters, and people are feeling that in the community. And not only that, but they're also doing their research more than before and finding out this information and recognizing that it is less expensive to own a cat, care for a cat. So then when we look at landlord restrictions, this is something we've been seeing for years. And Michelson actually did a study on pet inclusive housing, and they looked at all of the multifamily units across the country. If they had 5 or more units within a complex, then that was part of what they looked at for this research, along with Habry. And they found that 50% of pet-friendly houses restricted size or breed. And so, well, I'm sorry, that was 50% of all rentals restricted size and breed, or size or breed. And what they saw is when they looked at pet-friendly units, 76% of owners and operators of these units said that they were pet-friendly, but only 8% actually were. They were only 8% were free of all restrictions. And so when we look at the housing that's happening across the country and within the community, recognizing that really only 8% of available rental housing in multifamily units is truly pet inclusive, that creates an automatic different or smaller pool of audience for us. And that also doesn't include, the ESAs and the illegal pets that we've all had over time of sneaking in the cat or two, dogs even. But from what people actually have available to them, this is what we're working with. And so in this research, they estimated that if we could actually ease that up, we could make homes for another 8.2 million animals. And when you look at the slide that we just talked about of how many cats and dogs are being adopted and how many animals are coming into shelters, it could literally clear the shelter overnight if that were to happen, assuming all of those renters wanted pets as well and wanted to get them from shelters. But the interesting thing is this isn't new. This isn't a new problem. It is a problem that still exists, and it has since as far as I can remember. But when you look at the housing trends and of rented versus owned since 2015, it's more or less still flat. We are seeing a little more owned in recent years than 10 years ago, but not to the level that we would expect housing to play the only role or be the one thing that's happening and contributing to why there's fewer dog adopters. So that's another thing to keep in mind. Now, there could have been things that have shifted along the way with the pet-friendly rentals, but for the most part, it's looking like this is not a new problem, but it is still a problem. So, April?
All righty, let's talk about breeders are stealing our adopters. So we're gonna play a video. Let me just cue up the video before we show it because it'll move kind of quickly. But when we looked at that search trend, regardless of acquisition, there's like adoption and there's buying. And one of the things when we think about people looking to adopt a pet is adoption. What does adoption mean to the general public, and what does buy mean to the general public? And what's really interesting about I'm going to call them puppy broker sites now at this point, is that they will use adopt interchangeably with buy. They don't necessarily discriminate against the terminology. And it's because people do search for adoption, and the public doesn't necessarily always think of them as two different things. And so what's interesting is, next slide, I think, yeah, before we play the video, when everyone should go to their websites right now, just go to Google and search puppies for sale, dogs for sale, dogs for adoption, and see what actually shows up in the search results. And what you're going to find is that if you search puppies for adoption or puppies for sale or buy a puppy, you're definitely going to get all of these puppy broker sites. You're not going to get the person who has, they breed one litter of puppies every single year, or the person who's breeding for the breed, they care about the breed. You are going to get these big puppy broker sites. So let's look and see what it's like to buy a puppy on this video. So this video is not sped up. This is me. I want a hypoallergenic dog. Oh my God, there's like so many cute ones here. I pick Falstaff, I think is his name. Oh no, I picked Pip. Of course, I picked the most expensive dog on the site at $7,500. And what you see here is you can scroll through. We've got 4 photos that are right there front and center, and a quick 30-second video here where we can see him playing with toys and moving around. So, he's captured my heart right now. It's just like social media where we got some photos and video, quick video, short content that I can see. We can see all sorts of information about the dog, date of birth, when it was available, registration, weight, travel ready, the color. I can see everything that's included. I can see the potty training methods that have been used, types of socialization, early neurological stimulation used. So what kinds of stimulation this puppy's been around. So if I click ask about me, then I can put in my information. And do you think there's going to be any delay in them responding to me? No, no delay right away. But if I click reserve now, I can pick things like how I want the dog delivered. So air panion, I can have ground delivery, local pickup, standard air travel. I can include an extended 10-year health guarantee. I basically am going to certify I am who I say I am. And there you go. Check out. I pay for it. I can also choose 4 payments, interest free, and I can also choose financing as well. So if I don't want to pay that $10,000 today, I can go ahead and make payments on my puppy just like I would a car payment. And the reason why I think it's important for us to look at this is um, these sites make it so easy. I think it's Stephanie who said to me one time, she said, we're in like the Amazon era, right? Where everyone you want to go to Amazon and you want to click buy it now, you want to have it delivered, 2-day delivery. If you don't have 2-day delivery, forget it. You're not going to buy from that site, right? Like we're all conditioned for this buy it now. And that's what we're dealing with in that this is who's competing and taking some of the adopters, because if I reach out and I'm interested in a pet, let's say I saw your pet on Adopt a Pet and I reach out to you, how quickly are you going to get back to me? How quickly are you going to respond to my email? Are you going to pick up the phone if I call? What's the process to actually get this pet in my home? How many questions are you going to ask me? What's the length of your application? And I'm not saying that the adoption processes that shelters and rescue organizations have in place aren't warranted, but I want everyone to really think about if the the general public is coming and they're wanting to acquire a pet, which process are they going to be willing to go through? Are they going to be willing to go through the discomfort of potentially never hearing back or 30 days to adopt? Or would they rather go through the discomfort of making payments for the next 3 years and having that puppy delivered in 2 days? And that is something that we as an industry really need to be thinking about. And it can make the hairs on everyone's arms stand up like, oh, we don't want to be learning from puppy broker sites. But there are so many things we can learn from their sites. We know what's working. They're always running sales. The first thing when you come to their page, they've got beautiful pictures of puppies available for adoption. How many of you have your adoptable pets buried, 3 deep in a menu? If people are coming to your site and want to adopt, your adoptable pets need to be front and center. If that's what you need people to be doing on your site, they got to be right there. And so everyone should be looking at these sites. If you have a puppy store near you, I would recommend going in and seeing what that process is like. Don't buy a puppy, but just experience it, ask questions, ask about medical, what are they offering so you can understand that. And so that way, when people are coming to your site and they're interested, you know what those puppy brokers are offering, because that's who you're really competing with. I don't think you're competing with the one-off breeder in your community. It's these big sites like this who are stealing people before they even got to your website. Next slide.
April, I just want to point out something that
Yep.
you had called out on this video before. The top part, we're here daily, 8 a.m. to 11 p.m. Eastern.
Oh,
You want to talk about that?
Yeah, so their hours of operation are just incredible. So yeah, it's that little blue bar. It says at the very, very top, it says we're here 8 to 11 p.m. Eastern time. So if you call, you will be able to talk to somebody about this puppy and how you can get it. Like basically all day, every day. And then for places like Petland, you can actually reserve the puppy. So you can schedule a time where you're going to go into the store and actually meet the puppy, and they hold the puppy for you. And they are also open until 9 p.m. So when people get off work, they can go into a Petland and actually visit with that puppy. And so that's another thing to really look at is hours of operation. If I'm looking at 8 p.m. at night after I've been off work and we've been thinking as a family about getting a new pet, I come to this site, I can get someone on the phone, I can call them, I can place the order for the puppy. Whereas the shelter or rescue organization, do they even have a phone number for me to call? Do they have hours of operation that work for me? We did a study at Adopt Pet where we looked at all organizations that were open on weekends, and it was quite discouraging how many organizations were not open on Sunday at all. And depending on your area and like religion in your area, I can totally understand why you wouldn't be open on Sundays. But then Saturday hours were often reduced down to maybe 11 to 3. And then weekday hours, there were very few, if any, organizations who were open past 6 p.m. during the week. And most people have jobs that they work during the day or they've got, kids in school and different things like that. So there is an inconvenience to our operations that we need to think about how to adjust that and compete with the online purchases because that's who you're competing with. You're not competing with each other because nobody's open. You're competing with who's open, and that's these puppy broker sites online.
And the other thing that I think is really great about this demonstration too is your comment about even if you can't do all of these things to expand your customer service, letting people know what to expect is important. And like you were able to go through this whole add puppy to cart and know exactly what you're getting into and then cancel and come back to it later when you're ready. And so I saw in the question about or the chat about a question of impulsivity, and it's more that people want to know what to expect, so even making that very clear on what your adoption and application process looks like, where it's at all in one spot. And then even when they make that decision and they choose the pet that they want to come and meet, by the time they get to that point, if they have to come over lunch for the chance to maybe possibly be able to take that animal home, and then they have to take it home right away and they got to go back to work, that there's all of these things that we're doing things that we're doing for a reason, but it may not be a customer focused reason. It's really generally an internal focused reason. And so where can we learn from what they're doing that is all customer focused, because we both have the same goal of getting pets and homes. Theirs from a profit standpoint, ours from other reasons. So where can we learn from them? And even just include things like it's heard a doorbell before. It's
Yeah.
interacted with other animals.
Yeah, and you do not have to turn into a adoption brokerage site, right? Like we don't want to see this experience, I think, for adopters because we want to be able to talk to our adopters. And a puppy is very different than taking home a dog that's 2 years old, right? We know that is very different than bringing home a mature adult dog. But what is it that you can pull from this? Like, can you have people make appointments online? I think we did try that during the pandemic. I would be curious if anyone still does that where you'll hold a pet for someone if in the event that they can't come until tomorrow until 3 p.m. Does that work? What information can you put up there? Can you, and it looks like I'm seeing some people in the chat talking about just adjusting hours from closing at 5 until 7 was very successful from a shelter. So we're not saying you need to stay open until 9, but even just adjusting that to slightly later hours. And then another one said that they had a group, that was answering phones. Can you get volunteers to just answer the phone regardless? And even if the volunteer doesn't know about an individual pet, having someone to talk to about your process and what to expect is going to provide a very high level of customer service, and they will have a great experience, and then they will at least understand. So somebody's answering the phone and saying, here's what we need you to do. We want you to come in and meet the pet. The application is, we're going to ask you basic questions. This is what you can expect from that. And here's our hours. And the person's just getting that touch. That doesn't need to be staff. That can be anyone who just understands what you're doing. And at AdoptPet, we've been talking about maybe we need to be doing it for you. Maybe we need to understand every single organization's process so that we can help people stay engaged and not lose them to this really easy process of getting a puppy delivered for $10,000. That's the crazy thing. $10,000. People are doing it.
We're losing adopters that we are offering sometimes no adoption fees
Yeah.
to $10,000 because of other reasons, but a big part of it is convenience in the customer experience. Okay. So when we look at what's happening with actual dogs being adopted from shelters, we saw last year that of all of the dogs that entered shelters, 56% of them had an adoption outcome. That's all breeds, all sizes, all ages. You can see the other reasons for outcomes here in the pie chart too, but the one that's very notable for why we feel so full is that white 3% that says waiting for outcome. That means of all of the dogs that entered shelters last year, there were 3% that didn't have an outcome of any kind. And that would be manageable if that was just last year, but that we've been really seeing that trend since the pandemic. Every year there's more dogs waiting. Even though up until possibly this year, we weren't at the same level of number of dogs entering shelters as we were before the pandemic, but we were still feeling far more full than we ever felt before the pandemic. And that really is because of this imbalance. We had more coming in than leaving, which is an oversimplification of a very complicated challenge. But this, in the numbers and the data standpoint, where the intakes don't necessarily tell the full story, this is part of how you can look at the story within your own organization. And we have the formulas to do the population balance calculation and all of those things on our website. But when we look at then what that 50%, 56% of dogs means by size. So you see the 56% up in the top left, we see pretty consistent rate for small dog adoptions, pretty consistent rate for medium, although interestingly, I thought was we actually see a higher rate of medium adoptions than small. But no surprise, the large dog adoptions are drawing that down. And so this is what's contributing to the average of 56%. One thing that is hopeful from this is you can see we were a little higher for large dog adoptions in 2020. And last year and so far this year, we're starting to tick back up to that 2020 high that we celebrated. So there's potentially good news on the horizon, but we still have a lot of work to do with dog adoption outcomes. And especially when historically our industries relied on transfer as being another live outcome option. And as the transfer system, which we're going to be doing a dogs and data webinar next Friday, digging into the transfer system. But as that system continues to be bottlenecked and not at the same high volume that we relied on, we really need to shift that over to adoptions. So when we look at adoption rates by age, again, we combined several age groupings into these three that we'll go into. So essentially puppy, adult, and senior. We look at our puppies as having a high rate of adoption, but especially high in 2024. And if you figure most likely puppies that are entering shelters are leaving through an adoption outcome instead of a transfer or a return to owner, or even a euthanasia outcome, this probably isn't a huge surprise. However, it is a big spike than what we've seen since 2019. Then when you look at adult dogs, again, we've seen a spike so far in 2024. And then seniors, a spike a little less. But I think what this is showing overall is a hopeful trend of increase of adoption rates so far this year. There is some seasonality that may affect that as we go. But when we looked at this data initially, the seasonality didn't really tend to play a part in the full year data that we had for the past 5 years. So all things being hopeful, it looks like we are on a trend to improving some of these adoption rates, at least as a national aggregate. Everybody can be experiencing something different. And I always have to say in these presentations, we talk about data, our national data does not mean that you're not experiencing something different. Just as a different experience in your organization doesn't mean it's a national trend. So both things can be true, but when we look at this as a whole, this is what we're seeing. There are regional differences, there are state differences, and there's organizational types and all of those other differences. But as a whole, when we're comparing apples to apples as the sheltering system, this is what we've been seeing for the past now 6 years. So this is really my favorite part of the data that we've looked at for this animal level data by size is looking at length of stay, because this is really, I think, the population gap plus the length of stay is really what we're seeing as shelters are so full. And when we look at length of stay, we're looking at, for this next slide, we're looking at the median. So we're taking out those outliers of the dog that's been there 575 days in a foster home, probably is effectively an adoption at this point. They're just not ready to sign the paperwork, to the 8-week-old puppy that came in, was already altered and left through an adoption the next day. So we're taking out those and we're looking at the median common occurrences of length of stay with dogs. And we're also looking at only adoption outcomes. So only dogs that had an outcome of adoption. By the time they left, this is how many days they were in our care. And one, I'd be curious to know in the chat, how many of you know what your length of stay is? Do you know overall for organization? Do you know by size or by breed, species? Do you know by size? Do you know by age? Because these are really great indicators of where there are some moments for us to evaluate our process and our opportunities and learn from each other. I gave a version of this to this Prairie States conference last week, and not many people did know their length of stay. So that's a great opportunity. But then the length of stay ranged from 22 days to 88 days in that room. And so that is potentially some opportunities to learn from each other. And it also shows the different experience that we're each having in our organizations. So when we look by size, small dogs since 2019 have increased the length of stay by 50%. So we were at 9 days median in 2019, and now we finished last year at 14 days. So even those small dogs that have generally been are easy to adopt, we're seeing them wait 50% longer for that adoption outcome. Medium dogs, 80% from 10 days to 14 days. And large dogs, why we are feeling this urgent plea for large dog adopters. This is what that looks like in our shelters. Double. They're waiting twice as long for an adoption than they were prior to the pandemic. And 22 days was actually a lot lower than I would have expected to see for a national median. However, we heard of it being 88. And so this is, again, taking it as an aggregate. It's all over the board when we look at individual organizations. But as a whole, we know nationally, we're seeing twice as long for large dogs.
So let's talk about peer-to-peer adoptions. So we happen to have the largest database of peer-to-peer adoptions there is in the country because we have our Rehome by Adopt Pet. So it's this perfect opportunity for us to dig into that data a little bit and see what's going on there. So next slide. So I want to talk to you about pet profile quality, because when we look at peer-to-peer adoptions compared to shelter and rescue adoptions, there's definitely a big differentiator in the quality of the pet profile. So some of the things that we know about profile and adoption is that if the pet has house trained information, specifically on dogs, there's a 59% increase. They're more likely to be adopted if they have that information. That doesn't mean it has to say yes. It just has to have the information, yes or no. What do we know? Is this dog house trained? Then the next is if they have good with information. So do we know if this dog or cat is good with dogs, cats, or kids? They're 56% more likely to be adopted if we have this information. And then the next one is 54% more likely if they have the information about their vaccinations. So are they current on their vaccinations? I don't think this one is surprising considering we see the cost of care and how expensive it is. And we know how expensive it is for even to get a vaccination. It's killing me right now that it's $95 for me to walk into a clinic, a vet in my area, and that doesn't include anything. That's literally me walking in the door and the vet coming in the room. And then the next one is related to adoption fee. So this one doesn't necessarily help or hurt, but basically 81% of our users ranked adoption fee as top in importance of knowing what the fee is. And this goes back to that puppy site, right? Where like right front and center, they tell you how much it is. They're not afraid to say it's $7,500. Whereas on Adopt a Pet, we don't see adoption fee listed for shelters and rescue organizations all of the time. And we did recently kind of do some data around adoption fee. And so I'll share this kind of very early data we have. And it's that at $350 is where you really start to diminish your adopters. So anything under $350, people are very open to. They're willing to search, they're willing to look, they don't necessarily take it out of consideration. So if your dogs are listed at 100 or 150, it doesn't really mean too much to the adopter. It's at $350 is where you start to diminish people's interest based off of what's included with the adoption. And then the last one is just that they're 3 times less likely to get adopted if they don't have a photo. So the reason why I'm bringing this up is because we looked at all of these pieces of data and then looked at rehome pets compared to shelter and rescue pets on our site. And what we see when we look at this profile completion or quality is that rehome pets, regardless of your dogs or cats, have between, I think, 12 to, yeah, if you want to click next. There we go. So 12% of cats on rehome have a fully complete profile. So every single box is checked, every single piece of information that they could give us, they're giving us. And on dogs, it's 15%. And this is actually on the rise right now because of this personality indicator that we just added. Whereas shelters and rescues, it's 0.1% of cats have complete profiles and 0.3% of dogs have complete profiles. And so when somebody's coming on Adopt a Pet and they're looking at all of these different profiles, the rehome profiles just look better because they have more information. They're closer to matching what's on these sites out there of having all of this information about the dog, having whether or not it's house trained, whether or not it's lived with cats, whether or not it's lived with kids, has this cat lived with other cats. Whereas shelters and rescues, the profile completion is just so small. Now, I know that it's really hard for you as a shelter staff member to know, is this cat good with kids? Has it been around kids? But the general public doesn't actually know how shelters and rescues work. They don't usually, unless they volunteered or they've previously adopted and they have a relationship. They don't understand that shelters don't have kids coming through every single day that they're testing every single pet with. And so that's why it's really important that you at least include, we don't know, so that they know you don't know rather than just no information. If you have no information, it leaves them to nothing. They're like, oh, I'm not going to reach out to this organization because they're not giving me any information versus just saying, we don't know how this pet does with kids. We know this pet lived with cats. We know this pet lived with dogs, things like that. And then I think the next is, yeah, they're more likely to have a richer profile and have basically all the optional fields filled out. They do not have a higher adoption rate though than pets and shelters. Rehome is very similar. I think it's actually 60% of rehome pets are adopted, and we just saw for dogs it was 56%. So it's actually quite similar. They don't have a higher adoption rate. They just get more clicks and more interest on the initial interest. And then the next slide. So we went out and asked all of our users, what's important to you on a profile for the pet. And I think what you're going to see is there's so much here that's right in line with what we saw on that puppy site, like what they want to see. So the initial photo matters. They need to have a photo, and I could give a whole presentation on photos, which I may do next year at Expo. So keep your eyes out for that. Then health status was the second one. And when we think about health status, we oftentimes will get into this as a treatable, as a manageable, kind of the Asilomar Accords. But what the general public, what we found is what they're looking for is understanding cost of care. So, does this dog have a grade 5 heart murmur, which is going to mean that he's got to go on medication right away? Does this cat have diabetes? And when they do have something that's going to require care, it's really important that they understand what that cost of care is going to be. And so, this is where you can actually put information in the pet's story saying, on average, the food for this medical issue is going to cost you $100 per month. Or if you're a shelter or rescue organization that provides care for the life of the pet post adoption, you want to include that, because that's what we we believe, based off of the survey and the information we got out of it, is driving the interest here is just that the cost of care is so substantial, vet care nowadays, that they want to understand what they're getting into outside of the adoption fee. Because let's face it, the adoption fee is literally just like a drop in the bucket when it comes to pet ownership. It's really not how much it's going to cost you to care for that pet in the first year. And then the next thing, which was right up there with health status, was behavior and personality indicators. And so people still come to our site and search by breed. We know breed is a proxy for size, and we know breed is a proxy for personality indicators. And so if we can get more information around the pet's personality, it is going to help them get away from that breed specific interest and understand what this pet's going to be like in their home. And so with Adopt a Pet, I always say we have personality indicators now that you can add. We have 20 of them to choose from. But what I would tell you to do from an operational standpoint is to have a list of personality indicators that you're okay with. Pick 20 of them, put them on computers everywhere. Just laminate them and put the list on computers everywhere. And just put into your operations that when people interact with a cat or a dog in your facility, that they come back and pick some personality indicators to put into their story, just to keep up on what is this cat like? Is it cheerful? Is it relaxed? Is it whatever those indicators you want to put? And pick three, and then let AI build your story from there if you want. But having those indicators is really going to help the person understand what it's going to be like once they get it home. Clarity on steps for adoption. We've talked about that, I think, in depth on how important it is for people to understand what do I need to do to actually adopt this pet. The accuracy of your pet profile. When was it last updated? When did the pet come in? Is this pet still available as of what date? Adoption costs. They want to know, what's it going to cost to adopt. If you're an organization that has a range of fees, include those fees in your pet story. So say all cat adoptions are between $50 and $100. You don't need to say the exact amount for that cat if you don't know. Put the range in so people know what to expect there. What I would say though is that you should get more and more comfortable with assigning an actual fee on your pet, because regardless of what site you're listing on, whether it's Adopt Pet, Pet Finder, 24 Pet, all of those, there is definitely some interest in moving towards allowing people to search by a range of adoption fees. And so having that fee is going to allow people to search what they're willing to commit to. Information about your organization, animal welfare organization. They want to know if you're a good fit for them, because most of the time they want to have a relationship with you moving forward. Once they've adopted from you, they think of you as like their organization, and they want to see if your adoption processes are going to meet their expectations as well. Include more videos and photos, your pet story. And then what's interesting here is volume of pets. There becomes, the ASPCA did a great study on this many years ago on less is more. You don't need to have 1,000 pets for adoption. We know that on Adopt Pet. Once we show them so many pets, they actually start losing interest because there's decision fatigue, basically, or the paradox of choice. And so volume of pets is just not as important as the others. So the key takeaways from this data, and I think really from kind of the presentation, is look at those sites, see what you can do, consider how you can compete against those. And is that the last thing on this one? Oh, get a quality photo of the pet. I think we should all know that as well. And then health indicators, personality traits, and if you know they're good with or they've been around, even if you don't want to say good with, if you know they've lived in a house with any of these or they've been fostered by somebody who had cats, kids, dogs, put it in the story because that's going to be helpful.
Great. So we have a few minutes left. I put a note to add any questions to the chat, and Maddie mentioned too, you can also email our help desk and we'll collect all of those for a part 2, since we don't have a lot to dig into all of them today. But a couple things that I saw in the chat were questions on some of the assumptions that we were making for the terminology we've been using. So apologize for that. AWO equals Animal Welfare Organizations. We love using acronyms in this industry. And Expo is a very shortened way to explain the Humane Society of the United States annual biggest conference that we have in our industry called, I think, Humane, what is it? Humane something Expo. We just always have called it Expo. But the reason I wanted to mention those two is the ASPCA Pro and Humane Pro both have huge opportunities for continued learning on all hosts of things. Like April's mentioned some things throughout here on studies that have been done. ASPCA just announced yesterday a new help and resource center that they relaunched that was immensely valuable with some of the research that April mentioned. So there's a lot of these things that we'll point to as we do a follow-up blog where you can find more information on some of these topics. But otherwise, we can, if there's any UC you want to answer in the next few minutes.
I think this last one's really good about not including information because it's creating barriers. What's interesting about not including the information is you're potentially losing online, at least. What I'll say is you're losing the person who may have clicked into that if you know the information. And I think it's always important that we think about online different than in shelter, because those are two different. When you've got them in your shelter or you've got them on the phone, that's kind of a little bit of a different situation than when they're just searching online and you never get to interact with them. I always think it's great to do a case study in your shelter to actually see what's going on in your community. Because when I talk about things, it's from like this national perspective. And what I would say is from my perspective nationally and what we see on Adopt Pet is it is better to include whatever information you have. The information you have around good with, or not even good with, and we're toying that around with the idea of not calling it good with any longer, and actually just calling it like has been previously interacted with or has lived with cats, kids, dogs, because you can have a dog that lives with other dogs but doesn't like want to play with other dogs. But I think you should include as much information as possible because what we're seeing is that's what gets people to click on your pet and gets them to reach out to you and express their interest is the more information that they have. So that would be my answer to that one. I know it's a tough one.
Yeah, I agree with that. Think about most people are generally adopting a pet every 10, 20 years, or maybe they had an experience 5 years ago, or they're new to the area. There's all of these unknowns that people already have about the whole process that if we can take some of those questions out of it and really, April said, it's this online funnel to drive them into the organization. So it's very easy to say, we don't, especially as a stray, we don't know this dog's experience with kids or other pets, but come into the shelter and meet them and we can talk to you more about, da, 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 da. Or we have links on how to introduce them to other pets in your home. Because even if they weren't great with one pet in the home, it may have been that pet or that environment, just like litter box issues, not the cat, it's the environment. And so those are things that we owe them a level of transparency, but as was very aptly mentioned in the chat, it's about PR. It's about meeting the customer where they're at, knowing what they expect, knowing what their other options are with the puppy broker sites and path of least resistance if all they want is a dog, and trying to make this process easy in a way that we feel good about getting people matched with new family or new pets as part of their family. So I love April's answer on testing. It goes right to the data standpoint. And the great news is a lot of us have a lot of information on what results we've gotten from what we've done so far. And so now is a great time to use that as the baseline and start testing and comparing. 30 days. I mean, even looking at what your length of stay is for 30 days and what things you can do to maybe tweak that, and then see if you had good results, keep the good things and get rid of the other and just keep tweaking. Any others that you've seen?
No,
Oh,
there was one I think that was just asking us why we think dog interest is kind of waning, and I have no idea. I really have no clue. I don't know if it's a generational thing. I don't know if is it that everything that's being built now is 35 pounds and under? I don't know. Cats rule the internet, and they've ruled the internet for like 10 years now. Maybe it's just finally catching up where now everybody wants a cat. I wish we knew. I don't we have conversations about this, like people who love data sit in rooms and we're like, what's going on? I don't think we actually know. And I think maybe we need, maybe as somebody who has like, 4 million people coming to their website every month, maybe I need to ask. Maybe this is the question I need to ask, why you didn't consider adopting a dog. So stay tuned. Maybe we'll be putting on a presentation around what are we learning from the actual users on Adopt a Pet about why they're choosing cats instead of dogs, or yeah, what's going on? Because there's definitely something happening. I just don't think we know why. This presentation was really about the why we think as an industry and what data we have as an industry, but doesn't necessarily tell us what's going on with the search trends and why those are going down.
Yep. And what we know for sure is that people are still adding pets to their home every day, even despite housing restrictions and the high cost of pet care and all of the other things. And so our challenge and our fight is to be a part of that acquisition channel, a bigger part, so that they're choosing adoption first. And like April said, lots more to come. So we'll hang on so you can keep adding things to the chat so we can collect for part 2. We'll share the recording with everybody after this, and excited for future conversations. Please join us for Dogs and Data next Friday. We have information on how to register on our website, and we'll continue these conversations as we go throughout the summer. Thanks all.